If I had known what that smoke was hiding, I would never have opened that door. That was the sentence a neighbor repeated in a trembling voice long after the truth in Madrid, 1888, had already begun to spread through the streets like an infection that no one could contain. Because what started as a faint burning smell inside a quiet apartment building on Fuencarral Street did not just become a fire, it became the beginning of a question that would haunt an entire city for years. A question about what really happened behind a closed door when no one was watching and no one was supposed to know. And the strangest part was that there was no scream, no desperate call for help, nothing that usually comes when life is still fighting to hold on, only silence. A heavy unnatural silence that made the neighbors hesitate even when the smell of smoke grew stronger and more certain. Before we go deeper into this case, welcome to the Story Vault, where we uncover true crime mysteries buried in history, and if this is your first time here, take a moment to like this video. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts as the story unfolds, and subscribe, because your support helps bring more forgotten cases like this one back into the light in a way that keeps history alive and voices that were silenced from being forgotten. Because this story did not begin with smoke, it began decades earlier, with a woman named Luciana Borcino, who was born in the coastal city of Vigo in Galicia, Spain, sometime in the late 1830s. A period when Spain itself was still recovering from political unrest and the echoes of the First Carlist War, a time when families lived with uncertainty and survival depended not only on work but on reputation, discipline, and how well one could endure hardship without drawing attention. Luciana grew up in a modest household, not wealthy but respected in the quiet way working families often are, where life moved slowly but carried weight in every decision, and even as a young girl she was known to be observant, serious, and unwilling to accept disorder easily, traits that would later define how she lived as an adult in a city far larger and far more dangerous than the one she was born into. As she grew older, Luciana eventually married José Vázquez Varela and left Galicia behind, moving to Madrid during a time when the city was expanding rapidly, crowded with new people, new buildings, and new tensions. A place where opportunity and danger often lived side by side without warning. In Madrid, life did not become easier for her, instead it became more complicated, because she eventually became a widow, and in that time period widowhood meant independence on paper but vulnerability in practice. As a woman was expected to manage property and household matters alone while still maintaining a reputation that could be destroyed by a single rumor or accusation. Luciana was said to be strong-willed and strict, but also generous in her community, a woman who did not easily trust others but still helped when she believed it was right. And this balance of firmness and compassion made her both respected and sometimes feared in her own household. But the most important part of her life was not her reputation, nor her independence, it was her only son, José Vázquez Varela, a boy who would grow into a man surrounded by controversy and violence. A man whose presence would slowly turn what remained of Luciana's life into something tense, unpredictable, and increasingly unstable, although at the time no one yet understood just how far that instability would eventually go. And in the background of their lives, arguments began to form, not loud at first, but frequent enough to be noticed by those living nearby, especially when the topic of money or control came up. Because between mother and son there was always something unresolved, something that neither of them seemed willing to fully let go of. And as those tensions grew quietly inside the walls of their home, the city of Madrid continued to move around them, unaware that inside one small apartment, a chain of events was slowly building toward a night that would end in smoke, silence, and questions that would refuse to disappear. At first, neighbors did not think much of it, because arguments were common in crowded Madrid buildings, but Luciana's home carried a different weight, a silence that followed conflict as if something unresolved lingered behind the walls. Her son, José, was sometimes seen arriving late at night, moving quickly through hallways, avoiding eye contact, while Luciana remained known for her strict control, especially when it came to money and decisions inside the home. A tension that slowly widened the distance between them. There were moments when things appeared normal, short periods of quiet that made it seem like the conflict had cooled, but those moments never lasted long enough to feel safe. Something about their relationship was changing in ways no one could clearly define, a growing instability that lived beneath everyday life, unnoticed but present. Looking back, neighbors would later admit that the signs were always there, hidden in small details like hurried footsteps, tense voices, and doors closing too sharply, all pointing towards something building quietly toward an unknown breaking point. And yet, despite all of this, no one in the building could have imagined how far things would go, because family disputes were still treated as private matters that rarely turned into anything irreversible. But in Luciana's home, something was changing, as control, pride, and resentment began to feel less like passing emotions and more like pressures slowly tightening inside the same space, shaping every interaction. Outside, Madrid continued its normal rhythm, unaware that inside that apartment, every small argument and silence was quietly building toward a point of no return for both of them. The distance between Luciana Borcino and her son, José Vázquez Varela, did not collapse all at once. It broke slowly, in pieces so small that even those watching from the outside could not clearly name when the relationship had started to fall apart. Only that something between them had changed and never returned to what it once was. In the days leading up to the night of the fire, neighbors in the building on Foncarol Street began to notice a pattern that felt uncomfortable but still unclear, moments of raised voices behind closed doors. Followed by sudden silence that felt heavier than the arguments themselves, as if something was being held back rather than resolved. Luciana was not a woman who easily gave up control, especially not in her own home, and as she grew older, that need for order seemed to tighten around everything she touched, including her relationship with her only son, who by then was no longer a boy but a man already marked by rumors, conflict, and violent behavior that had followed him for years. José Vázquez Varela had become a figure of unease within his own community, not because of one single act, but because of a growing list of troubling reports that included aggression, disputes, and incidents that suggested a temper that could shift without warning, and each of these stories, whether fully true or partially exaggerated, began to form a reputation that clung tightly to his name. And inside the home he shared with Luciana, that reputation did not stay outside, it followed him in, shaping every interaction between mother and son, turning even simple conversations into exchanges filled with tension that neither of them seemed willing to fully confront or resolve. Money became one of the central points of conflict, not just as a resource, but as a symbol of control, independence, and resentment, because Luciana, despite being a widow, maintained strict authority over her finances, while José, who struggled with instability in his own life, often saw that control as something personal, something directed against him. Neighbors would later recall that when José visited, the atmosphere in the apartment would shift, not dramatically at first, but enough to feel like the air itself had changed. As if every word spoken carried more weight than necessary and every silence lasted just a little too long. There were moments when voices would rise, but never long enough for outsiders to clearly understand the words, only the tone, sharp, controlled, and sometimes cutting, followed by the kind of silence that suggested neither side had truly won the exchange. And then, just as quickly, there would be calm again, but it was not the kind of calm that came from resolution, it was the kind that followed emotional exhaustion, where nothing is solved, but everything is temporarily held in place. Luciana's personality played a major role in how these conflicts unfolded, because she was known in her community as a woman who did not bend easily, someone who believed in discipline and structure, and while that earned her respect from some, it also created distance between her and those who expected softness or compromise. José, on the other hand, carried the weight of someone who was constantly being judged, not only by his actions but by his past, and as those judgments accumulated, his presence in the household became less like that of a son returning home and more like a pressure entering a space already under strain. In the days just before the incident, there were small but noticeable changes. Neighbors recalled seeing José moving through the building more quickly than usual, avoiding conversation, sometimes arriving late at night, while Luciana remained mostly inside, rarely seen but often heard through faint sounds that suggested she was not at ease. Still, nothing about these moments was loud enough to demand immediate attention, because in a crowded city like Madrid, private tensions were common, and most people learned not to interfere unless something clearly crossed the line. But behind that silence, something was building that neither of them seemed able to escape, a combination of resentment, control, An unresolved conflict that no longer depended on a single argument but had become a constant condition of their shared space. There were also whispers of past violence, stories that circulated quietly about José's behavior outside the home, including incidents involving aggression toward others, and while not every detail could be confirmed, the repetition of these accounts shaped how people later interpreted everything that followed. And Luciana, despite her strength, was not untouched by this, because being tied to someone with such a reputation meant that every decision she made was now viewed through the lens of caution, fear, and the need to maintain control over a situation that increasingly felt unstable. Still, life inside the apartment continued in a way that appeared normal to outsiders. Meals were still prepared, doors still opened and closed, and from a distance, nothing would have suggested that a turning point was approaching so closely. But tension has a way of existing quietly before it becomes visible, and in this household, it had already reached that stage where even silence felt intentional, where every interaction carried unspoken meaning, and where both mother and son seemed to be living inside the same space without truly sharing it anymore. And as Madrid moved through its usual rhythm of noise, commerce, and daily life, the apartment at Fuencarral Street remained one of many places where something was breaking slowly, quietly, and without anyone realizing that it was already too late to stop it from reaching its end. On the evening everything changed. Madrid did not feel any different from the nights before it. The streets were still busy, the buildings still crowded, and life still carried on with its usual rhythm of movement and noise. But inside the apartment at Fuencarral Street, something was already different in a way that no one outside could see or fully understand. Luciana Borcino was inside her home that night, as she usually was, moving through familiar spaces that had long stopped feeling peaceful, while her son, José Vázquez Varela, was also present in the same orbit of walls and doors. Two lives sharing a space that had slowly turned from a home into something far more tense and fragile. What exactly happened in the hours before the fire remains one of the most unsettling parts of this case, because there are no clear witnesses to the final moments inside the apartment, only fragments, assumptions, and the later reconstruction of events by investigators trying to make sense of what came after. But what is known is that at some point during the night, something shifted inside that apartment, something that moved the situation from long-standing tension into irreversible collapse, although at the time, no one outside could have known that the breaking point had already been reached. In the hours that followed, neighbors would later recall noticing a faint smell, something burning but not immediately alarming. The kind of scent that at first blends into the background of a busy building before slowly becoming impossible to ignore. At first, there was confusion, because fires were not uncommon in tightly packed Madrid residences, and people often hesitated before reacting, hoping that what they were sensing was temporary or harmless. But as time passed, the smell became stronger, and the sense that something was wrong became harder to dismiss. Then came the silence. Not ordinary silence, but the kind that feels unnatural when it comes from a place where life is usually present, because no voices could be heard from Luciana's apartment, no footsteps, no movement. Nothing that suggested anyone inside was responding to what was happening. That absence of sound became one of the first things that unsettled the neighbors, because even in conflict, even in distress, human presence usually leaves some trace, but here there was nothing. Only growing uncertainty and a sense that something had gone very wrong. Eventually, concern turned into action, and people began to move closer to the source of the smell, hesitant at first, then more urgent as the signs of smoke became clearer, until the situation could no longer be ignored and help was called for. When the authorities arrived, the building was already in a state of alarm, with residents gathered in corridors, pointing toward the source of the smoke, trying to explain what they had noticed. While uncertainty spread through the crowd as everyone waited for answers that were not yet available. Firefighters worked quickly to control the situation, and once the immediate danger was reduced, the attention shifted from survival to investigation, because it was no longer just about a fire, it was about what had caused it, and what might be hidden inside the apartment itself. When entry was finally made into Luciana Borcino's apartment, what investigators found did not fit the pattern of a simple accident, because the interior showed signs of disturbance that suggested struggle, movement. and disruption that could not easily be explained by fire alone. Furniture was not in its usual place, objects appeared displaced, and the overall condition of the room gave the impression that something had occurred before the flames fully spread. Something chaotic and forceful that left behind traces of disorder. And then came the most important discovery: Luciana Borcino was found inside the apartment, no longer alive, her presence confirming that this was not just a fire incident but a death scene that required immediate and deeper investigation. From the beginning, authorities began to question whether the fire had been the cause of death or something used after the fact, because certain details did not align with what would normally be expected in an accidental fire situation. There were early indications that her injuries could not be explained solely by smoke or flames, and this raised the possibility that she may have been harmed before the fire began, changing the entire direction of the investigation almost immediately. As news of the incident began to spread beyond the building, Madrid slowly started to take interest, because stories involving death, fire, and family always carried a particular weight in a society already sensitive to scandal and tragedy. And very quickly, attention turned toward the person who had the closest connection to Luciana, her son, José Vázquez Varela, a man already known within his surroundings for a reputation that included conflict, aggression, and troubling behavior in the past. Investigators began to reconstruct his movements, his relationship with his mother, and the events leading up to that night, trying to understand whether the growing tension between them had reached a point where it could explain what had happened inside that apartment. And as more details began to surface, the story started to shift from a mysterious fire into something far more personal and far more disturbing, a case that no longer centered only on what caused the flames, but on what may have happened between a mother and her own son behind closed doors. But even at this stage, answers were still incomplete, and the most important question remained unresolved, because while the fire had been discovered, the truth behind what triggered it was still hidden inside the silence of that apartment, waiting to be fully uncovered. After the discovery inside the apartment, Madrid did not wait for certainty before it began forming its own version of the truth, because in moments like this, when a mother is found dead and a son is already surrounded by suspicion, the story spreads faster than any investigation could ever contain. José Vázquez Varela quickly became the center of attention, not because there was direct proof at first, but because of everything that surrounded his name long before that night: the reports of violent behavior, the repeated arguments with Luciana, and the growing belief that their relationship had been breaking down for years in ways that could no longer be ignored. Investigators began retracing his steps, speaking to neighbors and individuals who had observed him in the days leading up to the incident, trying to determine whether there had been a final confrontation or any clear trigger that could explain what unfolded behind the locked doors of the apartment on Fuencarral Street. What emerged was not a single moment of collapse, but a long pattern of tension, especially around money and control, with Luciana described as firm and unyielding in financial matters, while José reportedly saw her decisions as personal rejection and restriction, fueling resentment that grew quietly over time. Witnesses could not point to one defining argument that night, but many recalled that the atmosphere between them had never been calm, only shifting between silence and conflict, as if something unresolved was constantly sitting between them in the same space. As suspicion increased, the fire itself became a key question, because investigators began to consider whether it was accidental or deliberately set, possibly used to hide what had already happened inside the apartment before the smoke and flames spread through the room. Medical observations from the time added weight to this concern, suggesting that Luciana's injuries were not fully consistent with death caused only by fire, raising the possibility that she may have been harmed before the blaze began, changing the entire direction of the investigation. That detail transformed everything, shifting the case from tragedy to suspected murder, and placing José under even greater scrutiny as authorities built their case from circumstance, behavior, and the condition of the apartment rather than direct eyewitness evidence. Soon, newspapers across Madrid picked up the story, turning it into a public sensation, a case that people discussed everywhere. Not only because of the crime itself but because of the disturbing idea of a son and mother connected through something so dark and irreversible. During the trial, the prosecution argued that the combination of prior violence, financial disputes, and long-standing hostility formed a clear motive, while the defense insisted that suspicion alone could not replace hard evidence. Especially in a case where fire had likely destroyed critical proof. But despite the uncertainty, the court ultimately delivered a guilty verdict against José Vázquez Varela, closing the case in legal terms but not fully erasing the questions that lingered beneath it. Even after the judgment, the story of Luciana Borcino remained unsettled in public memory, a reminder of how quickly private tension can turn into irreversible tragedy when silence replaces resolution. And if this story made you think, don't forget to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the Story Vault, where we uncover true crime mysteries that history never fully let go of.